Every powerful nation follows the same pattern. They borrow to grow. They grow faster than expected, and for a while, it looks like nothing can stop them. But then something shifts. The same debt that built their rise starts pulling them down. Not all at once, not loud enough to panic, but fast enough that by the time people notice, it's already too late to escape. A nation does not fall in a single moment. It begins quietly, behind closed doors, under soft lighting, where polished tables reflect the confidence of men who believe they are building the future. Cameras flash, pens glide across paper, a deal is signed, a loan is secured. The headlines celebrate it the next morning: historic funding for national development. The words feel powerful, reassuring, necessary. Citizens read them and imagine roads, hospitals, schools, progress finally within reach. And for a while, that vision becomes reality. Construction begins, steel rises from the ground, asphalt stretches across forgotten land, electricity hums through places that once sat in darkness. Growth appears, not as a promise, but as something visible, tangible, real. The country feels like it is moving forward. But movement and stability are not the same thing. What no one sees in that moment is the invisible structure forming beneath the surface, the obligation, the timeline, the quiet contract with the future. Debt is not just money, it is a claim on tomorrow. At first, it feels harmless, strategic even. Governments borrow to accelerate what would otherwise take decades. They compress time, they bring the future closer. And that creates something dangerous: momentum. Because once a nation experiences accelerated growth, slowing down becomes politically and psychologically unacceptable. Expectations rise. Citizens adapt quickly to improvement. Leaders begin to rely on that momentum to maintain control, credibility, and support. So they borrow again. Not recklessly, not yet, but deliberately. Each new loan feels justified. Another project, another expansion, another promise fulfilled. The system appears to be working exactly as intended. And in the early stages, it is. Debt behaves like fuel. It amplifies output. It masks inefficiencies. It allows systems that are not fully stable to appear strong. Weak institutions look capable. Fragile economies look resilient. But fuel runs out, or more accurately, it demands replenishment. And that is where the shift begins. Because over time, borrowing stops being a tool. It becomes a dependency.
Budgets are no longer built around what the country earns, but around what it can access. Revenue becomes secondary. Financing becomes central. The question changes from what can we afford to what can we borrow? And that question has no natural limit, because lenders exist. Global institutions, foreign governments, private investors, each one willing to provide capital, each one calculating risk, each one attaching conditions that seem distant in the moment. But conditions do not disappear. They wait, and so does interest, compounding, expanding, growing silently in the background while attention remains fixed on visible progress. This is the first stage of the trap, where everything looks like success and nothing feels like danger.
From a distance, the country looks unstoppable. Economic reports show growth. International observers point to rising GDP. Investors speak of opportunity, of untapped potential, of a nation finally stepping into its place on the global stage. The narrative is clean, compelling, convincing. But beneath that narrative, the foundation is shifting. Because growth driven by borrowing is not the same as growth built on productivity. One expands possibilities, the other postpones limitations. And over time, that difference begins to matter. At first, debt sits quietly within the system. It exists, but it does not dominate. Governments still have flexibility. They can invest, spend, adjust. The future feels manageable. But then the numbers begin to change. Debt servicing, interest and repayments, starts to consume a larger portion of national revenue. Not dramatically at first, just enough to be noticed, then enough to require adjustment.
Budgets tighten. Decisions become harder. Every dollar spent must now compete with obligations that cannot be delayed, and obligations do not negotiate. They arrive on schedule, regardless of economic conditions, regardless of political transitions, regardless of unexpected crises. This is where the illusion deepens. Because outwardly, the country continues to grow. Projects are still completed. Announcements are still made. The image of progress is maintained carefully, deliberately. But internally, flexibility is shrinking. And flexibility is survival. Without it, even small disruptions can trigger larger consequences. So governments adapt the only way they can. They borrow more, not because they want to, but because they must maintain momentum. Growth must continue. Confidence must be preserved. The system depends on it. And here, the trap tightens. Because new debt is no longer just funding development. It is sustaining the existing structure. Old obligations are managed with new borrowing. Short-term solutions replace long-term planning. The timeline extends, but the weight increases. Meanwhile, external conditions begin to shift. Global interest rates rise. Investors become cautious. Risk is reassessed. What was once easy access to capital becomes more selective, more expensive, more conditional. And then comes the most dangerous variable of all, currency. Because many nations borrow in foreign currencies they do not control. Dollars, euros, yen, strong, stable, externally governed. But revenue is generated locally. And when the local currency weakens, everything changes. Repayments become more expensive overnight. The same debt now requires more resources, more effort, more sacrifice. Not because the country borrowed more, but because the environment changed. And in a system already stretched, even small changes can have enormous consequences.
It never starts with collapse. It starts with discomfort. Small, almost unnoticeable shifts in the system. Prices inch upward. Imports become slightly more expensive. Fuel costs fluctuate unpredictably. Businesses begin to adjust, quietly at first, then more visibly. Citizens feel it before they understand it. Because economic stress does not announce itself in headlines. It appears in daily life, in the cost of food, in transportation, in the subtle tightening of opportunity. And once it begins, it does not remain small. Currency depreciation accelerates pressure. Inflation follows. What used to be manageable becomes unstable. What used to be predictable becomes uncertain. And uncertainty spreads quickly. Investors notice. They always do. Capital begins to move outward, away from perceived risk. Markets react faster than governments can respond. Confidence, once strong, becomes fragile. And when confidence weakens, everything becomes harder. Borrowing costs rise. Access to funding narrows. Conditions tighten. What was once routine becomes negotiation. Meanwhile, the government faces an impossible equation. Debt repayments are increasing. Revenue is under pressure. And the population is demanding relief. There is no easy solution. So difficult choices are made. Spending is cut. Taxes are raised. Subsidies are reduced or removed entirely. Policies are introduced to stabilize the system. But stabilization often comes at a cost. And that cost is felt immediately. Economic activity slows. Businesses struggle. Unemployment begins to rise.
growth, once strong, begins to fade.
This is the paradox of the debt trap. The actions required to fix the system can weaken it in the short term. And in that weakness, new risks emerge. Political tension increases, public frustration grows, trust in leadership begins to erode. Promises that once felt credible now feel distant, disconnected from reality, because the experience of the people no longer matches the narrative of progress. And that gap is dangerous. Then comes the moment that changes everything. It might be a missed payment, a failed bond issuance, a sudden downgrade from international rating agencies, or simply a shift in perception strong enough to trigger a reaction. But when it happens, it moves fast.
Because markets do not wait, they respond. And once they respond, the situation escalates beyond control. The country is no longer managing its debt. It is being defined by it.
Costs rise faster than incomes. Opportunities shrink. Stability disappears. What once felt like progress now feels like regression. And frustration grows, not just economically, but socially. Because people begin to realize something fundamental. The system they trusted is no longer working for them. And that realization changes everything. Protests emerge. Political pressure intensifies. Leadership becomes unstable. Decisions become reactive rather than strategic, because survival leaves no room for vision, only response. And in that environment, mistakes become more likely. Desperation leads to short-term fixes. Temporary solutions replace structural reform. The cycle continues, but now under greater strain. The trap is no longer forming. It has closed.
At this stage, there are only two paths forward. Neither is easy, neither is painless, but one leads to destruction. The other offers a chance, however small, at recovery. Collapse is the path of default. Missed payments, broken agreements, loss of credibility in global markets. Investors withdraw completely. Access to capital disappears almost overnight. The currency weakens further. Inflation spirals. Institutions struggle to function. And the damage extends far beyond economics. Because once trust is lost, rebuilding it takes years, sometimes decades. This is the cost of unmanaged debt. But there is another path. Reset.
It is controlled, negotiated, structured, but no less difficult. Debt is restructured, payments are delayed, terms are adjusted. In some cases, portions are reduced or forgiven, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. Because lenders understand something important. A country that collapses completely cannot repay anything. So compromise becomes strategy. But reset comes with conditions of its own. Reform. Deep structural changes designed to rebuild the foundation of the economy. Fiscal discipline, transparency, efficiency, systems that prioritize sustainability over speed. And these changes are not immediate. They take time. Time during which the population continues to feel pressure. Time during which progress appears slow, almost invisible. But beneath the surface, something begins to shift. The dependency weakens. The system stabilizes.
And slowly, carefully, the country begins to rebuild, not on borrowed acceleration, but on controlled, sustainable growth. This is the difference. Collapse destroys. Reset restructures. One ends the story, the other rewrites it. But both require something most nations struggle with: acceptance. Acceptance that the previous model failed. Acceptance that change is necessary. And acceptance that the future cannot be built the same way as the past. Because the debt trap does not just expose economic weakness, it exposes structural truth. And not every country is prepared to face it. Debt is not the enemy. It never was. In fact, some of the most successful nations in history were built using borrowed money. Infrastructure, innovation, expansion, none of it happens at scale without access to capital. Debt, when used correctly, is a tool, powerful, transformational, necessary. But like all powerful tools, it demands control, because the line between leverage and liability is thin, and once crossed, it is difficult to reverse. The real danger is not borrowing, it is dependence. When a nation begins to rely on debt not as a supplement but as a foundation, the system changes. Incentives shift, priorities distort. Long-term strategy is replaced by short-term survival.
And that is where the trap begins. Not in the first loan, but in the mindset that follows it. The belief that growth can always be sustained externally, that limitations can always be postponed, that future obligations will somehow become easier to manage over time. They rarely do, because debt compounds, not just financially, but structurally. It influences policy, it shapes decisions, it defines boundaries. Over time, it becomes embedded in the system itself, and removing it requires more than repayment. It requires transformation. This is the lesson most countries learn too late, that sustainable growth cannot be borrowed indefinitely. It must be built, from productivity, from efficiency, from systems that generate value internally rather than depending on external support.
Because true strength is not measured by how much a nation can borrow, but by how little it needs to. And this is where the story becomes personal. Because behind every statistic, every policy, every negotiation, there are people, citizens who experience the consequences directly, who feel the impact not as theory, but as reality. And for them, the debt trap is not an abstract concept. It is a lived experience. Rising costs, fewer opportunities, uncertain futures, all connected to decisions made years, sometimes decades earlier. Decisions that felt safe, logical, necessary, until they weren't. And that is the final truth. Nations do not collapse because they borrow. They collapse because they lose control of what borrowing becomes. And once that control is gone, the outcome is no longer a choice. It is a consequence.
Debt was never the problem. Loss of control was. Because once a nation depends on borrowed money to survive, it stops building its future and starts negotiating with it. And history has shown over and over again that when that line is crossed, collapse isn't a possibility. It's just a matter of time.